expect to see you guys all next month. We're going to keep these rolling. We're going to try to do them every month. We're tentatively scheduling the third Tuesday of every month, so put that in your calendar, pencil it in. We'll set up the meetup invite so you can see it online as well, but just keep that in mind when you're trying to plan out your, your vacations and things. Make sure you don't go away on the third Tuesday. The agenda for tonight is partially over. The first part is just food and drink. Hope you enjoyed that. The pizza's over there if anyone just got in. The beer's in the back. This is all courtesy of Localytics. We got Dan here representing. They provide the venue, the food. Yeah, give them a round of applause. These guys are awesome. Localytics is a longtime sponsor of this meetup. Back when we were really rolling with things, we would come here all the time and eat their food and drink their beer, and they've always been really nice. And so yes, so definitely check them out online if you haven't seen them before. It's a really cool company. Does a lot around analytics, surprise, surprise, and mobile analytics, I think specifically, but Dan can tell you a lot more than I can, so talk to him afterwards if you're interested in that stuff. These are the opening remarks. They're very short. We're going to have Shane do a presentation on Gatsby and Drupal. So if you're not familiar with Drupal, I'm sure Shane will go into this a lot more, but Drupal is a CMS, content management system backend. It's built on PHP and MySQL. And you can use that to kind of host data, and there's a lot of API capabilities, and then we kind of have Jamstack on the front end to do some kind of display stuff, and Shane's going to show how that interaction works. Shane works at Third and Grove as a developer. He also started an online learning platform called Code Karate. It's interesting, my day job is doing Drupal development, and I know when I was learning Drupal many years ago, I was kind of coming across all Shane's videos online for free. It's a really cool platform, so he's been plugged into these communities for a long time. So thanks so much, Shane, for coming out. And is anyone here not familiar with what Jamstack is? Did you just see this online and you're like, that sounds cool? Or has most of the folks here? Okay, we've got some, okay. So Jamstack, so Jam stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And basically the idea with Jamstack is that you compile assets in a build time, and then you host those somewhere statically, so you don't actually need a backend web server for any of the interactions that you're doing. So for instance, you have a website that gets built, and then you can display that on like a CDN, a content delivery network, and many different networks around the area, and you don't have to worry about taking incoming server requests. You can hand that off to different microservices. So if you have form submissions, you could have Google Forms or something on Netlify or a Drupal site or something like that to handle that backend, and you're just worried about the front end side of things and the interactions with those APIs with JavaScript. If you want to stay connected with our meetup, we're on meetup.com. I assume that's where most people found out about us. We're trying to schedule these for every third Tuesday. We have a Twitter and a Facebook. Feel free to get in touch with us that way. I like to have as many tentacles around you guys as we can. You can't get away from us, so make sure you follow us on all the different things. And then you can always email us. This is just an email that Stephanie and I set up if you want to get in touch with us. We're always looking for speakers and sponsors and things like that, so if you're interested in any of those, come talk to me. Sponsors right now is our company Janku, which does the meetup subscription, and Localytics does pretty much everything. And on to the presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Shane. Can you just take over the presentation on Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you have to stop sharing.
How's that?
Looks good.
Okay. So let's give Shane a big round of applause and take it away.
All right. So we'll pull this down here. There you go. You see that, kind of? All right. So, thanks, Jim. As he mentioned, my name is Shane Thomas. Some background information on me. So I like to consider myself an entrepreneurial web developer. I have some business background, but I'm also a developer as well. So I go way back with Drupal. I've been doing Drupal-specific work for about 10 years through web development agencies as well as startups. So I have a lot of background in Drupal. And I also like to keep, as any developer here likes to do, try to keep your pulse on what's happening, right? What's coming next, what the emerging trends are. And so, Gatsby is one of those things that I've been really trying to track and trying to learn. And so I'll be sharing my knowledge, and hopefully if you have experience, you can share where I maybe could improve. So I do a lot of things. So as Jim mentioned, I run a website called codekarate.com. I teach people about Drupal. I have 200 plus videos, has 2+ million views. So I don't do it as much as I used to. Just time gets in the way of side projects and hobbies, as you can imagine. But I do have a lot of content and continuing to post some content to that site. I'm also a developer at a company. We're a remote company, but we have offices in Boston and in San Francisco area. And it's a company called Third and Grove. We build digital experiences with Drupal, Gatsby, Shopify, some React. Mostly Drupal, but a lot of Shopify coming up and a lot of some of the newer trends as well as far as React and Gatsby. Work with some big organizations like Mint, Quicken, Google, GE, and many, many others. I also run a startup called Learn, Create, Build Academy. We teach kids STEM skills. So we get them in an online Zoom like this, and we teach them technology through games like Minecraft and popular topics like video game design. So really trying to educate the next generation into doing kind of the geeky, nerdy things that I like to do. And I think a lot of you probably like to do as well. So we're here to talk about Gatsby. So, has anyone seen this movie? Which has nothing to do with this movie. But we're talking about this Gatsby. Who here has used Gatsby before? Okay, so about half, all right. Has anyone launched a live site using Gatsby? It's actually live in the wild. Well, that makes 2 people in this room, because I have not, but I'm almost there. So you'll learn from me, and hopefully you can share some of your knowledge with me as well. So what is Gatsby for those that don't know? Well, it's a free and open source framework based on React that helps developers build blazing fast websites and apps. So that's kind of informational. But that brings up the question, what is React? Does anyone have experience using React? So a lot of you have React backgrounds. Okay, so that's interesting. So you already know what React is, but it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's really a lot more than that, but that's kind of the simplified version, right? It's a library that you can use to build really dynamic applications. And then we have Drupal. Anyone have experience with Drupal? So a little less, but a few. So Drupal is, according to the Drupal website, it's the leading open source CMS for ambitious digital experiences that reach your audience across multiple channels, yada, yada, yada. It's a CMS. You can store data there, you can build websites, you can do a lot of things. It's really kind of an all-inclusive platform. It can do a lot, which is good in a lot of ways, and it's also bad in some ways too. And then one of the other technologies we'll be talking about today is GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language for your API. So that's a pretty simple definition. We'll go into what that means, because you might be thinking this. Some of these things you're familiar with, some you might not. There's a lot of terminology that gets thrown out anytime you're learning new development trends, right? You have to learn what all these new terms mean and how they work together. So we're getting out my handy problem-solving chart, and we're going to break down all these terms and try to simplify them, and then actually look at some real code, and we'll do a demo as well, so you can actually see how this might work in the wild. So Gatsby is a static site generator. So Jim had mentioned at the start about building static assets, right? It's about building static assets so you can deploy them out to CDNs, and you don't necessarily have that build time of building websites or the pages, right? It's all static. So it's built with React. So Gatsby is a static site generator, but it's not just static, right? It starts static, but you can do a lot more than just build a static website. So has anyone here built a website or built HTML pages with Notepad at some point in your life? Right? Maybe 15, 20 years ago, or a while back. So that was static, right? When we were building with Notepad, we were building static sites. So this is easy stuff, right? We've already done this. And you probably built something that looks kind of like this if you were building a site with Notepad. And I do apologize if about 15 years ago you were building an Istanbul travel site and I stole your screenshot. I apologize. But I apologize more if you were building this a few years ago and it looks like that. But you built sites with Notepad or Dreamweaver or FrontPage, right? And it was static assets, a static website. So why are we jumping in a DeLorean and going back in time and building static sites? So, as was mentioned earlier, a static site is simply, you're just displaying the HTML, the CSS, the assets. Where a dynamic site, you actually are going through this build process, you're building this page that you're then going to display to a user. And so with Drupal, it's a CMS. It's a really powerful data modeling tool on top of that. So you can actually build very complex, intricate, interrelated data structures to store all different kinds of data. So this, along with all the tools it gives you, makes it really easy to expose this data through an API. And that's where you can start to really see how these static sites and more of this content engine, really, that is Drupal, can start to work together. And GraphQL is the glue that kind of connects the two, right? We said GraphQL was this query language for APIs. And when you hear GraphQL, you might think you've heard of SQL. It's not necessarily the same thing. SQL is for databases, right? This is more of a query language for interacting with and working with APIs. So it's different, even though it kind of shares some of the same terminology. So we're using these three technologies, Drupal, GraphQL, and Gatsby. We're going to be able to use Drupal, build some content, whether it's blog posts, articles, recipes, your favorite CD collection, if you still listen to CDs, whatever it is, you put the content on there. Gatsby can pull in that data using GraphQL. So before we get started, just a few simple warnings. I am not a Gatsby expert, nor do I claim to be. I'm also not a comedian, but I'm going to try really hard at both tonight. So, as I mentioned, Gatsby's great at pulling in data, making a fast website. Drupal's great at exposing the data through an API. So there you have Gatsby and Drupal sitting in a tree. By the way, I don't know who designed this.
I just stole some images online.
So,
I don't have the links to the tree.
So,
I think the logos are okay to use, but I don't know about the tree.
Yeah, okay, well anyways, Jim didn't know he was designing content for my slides, and so no, I'm not paying you for the use of the design, but
I couldn't take the money. It's not my design.
But before we get started, Gatsby works great with other content sources. So we're going to be talking about Drupal, but just keep in mind it doesn't have to be Drupal. There's a lot of different things it can be. It can be WordPress, right? Some of you have used WordPress, I'm guessing. WordPress is pretty popular. Netlify CMS is kind of a newer backend. Some of you may have heard of it. Allows you to build data structures very similarly. Contentful, another competitor kind of in that same market, allows you to build data structures, expose it through an API. You can also source from a database. If you have a MySQL, Postgres, maybe Access, I don't know. If you use Access, it might work, I don't know, probably not. Or from the file system. So just as this slideshow is a Gatsby website. So it's sourced from the file system. It uses Markdown. Sorry, I'm not a designer, but you get this white page with text with some images. But it is a Gatsby site, right? It's built using React, pulls data from Markdown. It works. So why would you need Gatsby? And this is really talking if you're familiar with CMSs like Drupal, like WordPress, why do you need a tool like Gatsby? Why not just build the site with Drupal or WordPress or whatever else your other tools were in the past? Your current CMS might be enough on its own. You might not need Gatsby. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But one thing that really made it clear to me, and I heard this, is really the development philosophy behind Gatsby that will kind of hopefully articulate why it's different. So from the ground up, Gatsby was built to be fast. And I heard the quote saying, you have to work really hard to make a slow Gatsby website. You have to be trying pretty hard because it's just built with so many optimizations. And if it is slow, there's plugins that you can really speed up. We'll talk about some image optimizations you can do. There's a lot of things. But it's really built to be blazing fast from the ground up. So Drupal and other CMSs, if that's a word, they're built to have a lot of features. And you have to work hard to make those sites fast, right? And typically, you're going to try to accomplish this by adding things like caching, whether it's Memcache or Varnish, or caching at the application layer. If you're using Drupal, there's all different types of caching layers you can put in, whether it's menus, whether it's views, whether it's pages. So you're trying to cache, and all you're really doing is trying to accomplish what Gatsby does out of the box. You're trying to make those assets as static as possible. So you're really working from a dynamic page and trying to make it static to make it fast, where Gatsby is just static by default. That's really the biggest difference that I've seen is just kind of the philosophy of how it's built, right? I don't know if CMS is a word, but it works for me. So we're going to live dangerously. We're going to try a demo. If it fails, you'll see my coding on the fly ability, and we will see what happens. But what are we going to do? We're going to look at a local Drupal website. We're going to create just an article or a post on that site. We'll spin up the local Gatsby site. We'll show how it actually pulls the content from the Drupal website. And then we'll actually look through some Gatsby code and see how it's actually building those pages. So, doing pretty well on time. So, some things that we're going to learn. We're going to configure Drupal to work with Gatsby. It's really easy to set up. We're going to configure Gatsby to consume Drupal content. If you're familiar with React, a lot of this stuff's going to look pretty familiar. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about GraphQL. Not too much, but a little bit. I designed this, as you can see. It's very nice. Drupal pulls in data from GraphQL, or actually, Gatsby pulls in Drupal data with GraphQL, displays in a browser. Did anyone have a mom who like hung up art, like coloring pictures that, when you're a kid? My mom never did that, so this is what you get. I don't know why. I can't figure it out. But let's do this. All right. So I am going to stop this Gatsby site, and we will go to just this very simple Drupal development site. There's no front-end theme on this site, right? I don't need it. I'm not using Drupal for that. So it's not going to look pretty right here. Don't worry about that. But what we're going to do is we're just going to look at how Drupal lays out data. So Drupal stores data in something called content types. This could be a blog post. Like I said, it could be a recipe. Anything that you want to store data and possibly display to a user can be stored in a content type. Think of it like an object with fields. That's really all it is. So when I look at this very simple website, I have two content types. I have, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. That might be a little better. I have an article content type and a basic page content type. This is pretty much what you get out of the box with Drupal. You can add hundreds of other types of content types. Whatever data you need to model, you can do so. In this article content type, which is the one we're going to look at, there's a number of fields. We won't talk about all of them, but you have a body field. That's just like a CK editor, a WYSIWYG editor for a user to be able to insert their own HTML content, right? You can track an episode, which is just like if you have videos, you might have episode numbers, files, a transcript, which is a full text field, image, some meta tag info possibly, and a video, which is kind of the important one we're going to look at. So these are different field types, and you can store whether it's text, whether it's media, whether it's anything that you would have some type of data you want to store. Drupal either can do it out of the box or has modules to let you model that data. And so if we look at some of the content that's currently on this site, you'll see, we'll look at this one for instance. This is just a video on a Drupal 8 module. You can see there's a title, has some tags. If it was part of a longer term series of videos, I could tag it with a series. If there were related file attachments, I could put them in. There's a thumbnail image, some body text. Here's a video. and there's some more fields, right? And so this is, if you've ever used a CMS, it's not that much different. This is the default editing experience out of Drupal. It's pretty customizable. If you don't like it, you can obviously tweak it a little bit. But let's just add just a test post here. We'll just call it, we'll just give it a tag. We won't put it in a series. Just put in just some real basic stuff and we'll find a YouTube video. All right.
Guess what? I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.
All right, so we got a video. And I don't know why there we go. So I'm just going to drop in the URL. There's some additional fields I could put here. We'll just drop in the video. I'll give it just a URL. And we're just going to save this post. So it's nothing fancy, but it's going to prove the point, right? That we can put in data on the site and we can suck it into a Gatsby site and display it. All right, so let's go ahead and spin up a Gatsby site. So Gatsby can easily be run from the command line. Just Gatsby develop. There's a couple different commands. Yes?
Can you just make the text bigger?
Yes. We're not going to spend too much time on the command line, but I will make it bigger. So I'm just running a command. There's probably a few warnings and things that I haven't really worried about too much yet. But I just run Gatsby develop, and that's going to spin it up. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the command line. Really, I know two commands with Gatsby, Gatsby develop and Gatsby build. Those are the only two I've really had to use. There might be more, but Gatsby develop spins up your development environment. Gatsby build builds a production-ready working copy of your site. And what this is doing is this is going out now and using GraphQL, it's pulling in all of the nodes or content from the Drupal site. And we'll look at the code of how it does this in a little bit. But once it's done, it compiles those into static assets, and then it runs it on a local development server for me to look at. So if I refresh this page, all right, so there's my test post. Wasn't there before, you'll have to take my word for it, but now it's there. And it should play, should work.
Guess what?
And obviously all these other posts that you saw were there, right? It's just kind of like a really ugly looking blog.
Yeah, give it a live demo.
Yeah, it worked. And you click on the page and it gives you a little bit more information, tells you what the tags are, you know, tells you some additional stuff. Got a well-designed footer here that looks production ready. I mean, that's it, right? It's really simple on the surface, right? We're not getting into anything too complex. But the important thing to realize is making an API call, it sucked in the data and built a static site that I could then build and deploy through a static hosting provider. So let's actually take a look at some of the code inside Gatsby, and we'll see how this works and how this build process actually happens. So let me, and then I'll try to make this bigger too once I get it pulled up here. It's a little big, but all right. You can kind of see that, I hope. Is that good? Should I make it a little bit bigger? Or?
Yeah, one more.
There we go. That's about as big as we can get, I think. All right, so Gatsby has, it's going to be tough to see, but on the root level there's a file, Gatsby config, and this is just like any other config file that you've probably seen. The format's in JavaScript, but it's just a config file. It just tells Gatsby some information on what kind of plugins to load into your build process. So in order to get Gatsby out of the box to work with Drupal, I had to add 5 lines of code right here. And all it's saying is, and I'll show you how to actually install the plugin, but you install the plugin, you drop in these few lines of code, it's going to be able to go out to the API. So this is going to say, I'm going to go out to this website here, and I'm going to look for an API base of JSON API. So the one thing we didn't cover, and I'll hop back, is how do we actually, on the Drupal side, expose this data to an API? Because out of the box, it's not there, right? Your content's there, but it's not available through an API. So on the Drupal side, you simply would go to your modules page. In Drupal, you can download all different types of modules that extend the functionality. You would have already downloaded this, but you download a module called JSON API, and you would check this one box right here. That's it. You don't have to do anything else. There's one box once you download the JSON API module. There's some extra modules that provide additional information and functionality, but you don't need them. You need that one checkbox checked, hit save, your API is up and running, and Drupal knows how, because of the data modeling tools, it knows how to map the API, and the GraphQL on the Gatsby side knows how to interact with that API. So we configured Gatsby to now work with the Drupal site. When you first run the command, it goes through a build process. So there's also a file that is optional. It's not required, but if you want to do some kind of, think of it as like a compilation or your compiling step when you start the build, you can create a Gatsby node.js file. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to basically act on that build process, and you can tell Gatsby to create pages. So what we want to do, and this might seem a little confusing, some of you might already know it, but I'll walk through what this is doing. But essentially, just think of it this way. It's going out to that API, pulling in all the articles, and it's building those standard pages. So when I clicked on the actual article link, that page that showed me with the tags on top, that's the page it's building. And then I'll show you how the actual listing page, kind of that front page, is built as well. That's not this. This is just the individual, think of it like the article page itself, not the listing page or the front page of the blog. So what it's doing is it's running this create pages command that gets called when you first develop or run that Gatsby develop command or that build process. And it's going to run this piece of GraphQL. And to show you what that looks like, who here has used GraphQL before? Okay, so a few, but not too many, so that's good. So GraphQL, it essentially allows you to map what you're trying to grab to the API. So it's going to expose things to you just like it's exposing fields, and you can pull that data back. So that if you haven't seen this before, when I first saw it, I was very confused at the formatting of it. It's kind of like JSON format, but it's just it's a little funky if you're used to just, especially if you're coming from SQL queries or something where you just say I want this data. It's just a different format, but it does the same thing. So what this is saying here, if I can, so if we want to run, we'll run just simplify this a bit. All right. So if I run this query, so just look at this part right here. I'll make this a little bit bigger. All right, so what I'm saying here is I want all node article. So that first two words, this is part of the Gatsby Drupal source plugin. There's a few, it makes a few assumptions on how you want to access the data, right? But that last word, that article, that's the actual content type on your Drupal website. So if I wanted to get that basic page, if I just change this to page, then I'd be grabbing pages. If I created a new content type called recipes, I just change that to recipes, and then I could grab all the recipes. So whatever that machine name of that content type is, that's what goes there. And Drupal refers to things as nodes. Each piece of content is called a node. So it's just grabbing all the node articles. I'm running a sort. So this is the sort right here. I'm sorting by the created field, which is just the date the post was created, and I'm ordering that descending. So if you're familiar with SQL, it's kind of similar in verbiage, but a little different, right? And this is going to go out to the API, and this is actually what I'm pulling back. So the Drupal ID, that is a unique string that's going to return, that actually represents that content, the title, the created date, the path or the URL alias of that piece of content, and the body field. So you might be wondering, how do I know what's available? This GraphQL editor comes with Gatsby. So all I did here is I went in my local Gatsby build environment, 3 underscores GraphQL, and it pulls up this little editor. And it tells you that when you run the Gatsby develop command. And this will allow you to query your API. So if I don't know what's available, it auto-completes just like an editor. So if I'm wanting to grab, let's say, the episode field, I can grab field episode. Some fields will have things within it. This one doesn't, so there's nothing there. But we will show you here in a minute something that does. So if I grab that and I run it, now you'll notice over here, you can see each one of these is an individual post on the Drupal website. So you can see this one, this test post, didn't have an episode number. It's null. But the one before it was episode 221. And I could go down and I'd see, basically this is pretty much a map of the home page, right? It just pulls in all this data. And this create page process is going to create pages from this data. So if I wanted to add additional data, let's say I want to actually grab the video. Let's see. See if I can remember what it was here. There we go. What are the odds I get this right? Not very good. Syntax error. I did not get it right. Missing one more. There we go. All right. So, got it. But you can kind of fumble your way through this by using the autocomplete, right? So it just takes time when you're first mapping out what the data looks like. And to be honest, Drupal doesn't always provide data in the most intuitive way. So sometimes you have to dig to get this data. So in this case, I had to go into what's the relationships field, because it's when Drupal creates that video, it's actually a separate entity or object on the site, and it uses relationships to relate that. And so you have to find it through this relationships field. So it's a little trickier. All I'm doing here, so this is I'm saying I want to get the video field, so it's field underscore video, but I want to call it just video. So I just shorten it up a little bit. And this field, if I come back to the Drupal site, would be what's displayed right here in the machine name of the field. So if I wanted to get an image, again, an image is an entity reference field. That means it's making a relationship out to another entity. I would be in that relationship section looking for field image, and I could grab if there was an image field. So if I run this, you can obviously see it pulls in the video, name, I've got a fever, yada, 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 and there's the actual video link to the video I pasted in. And then, of course, I can ingest that in the Gatsby site and display it. So let's look a little bit more on what's making this kind of tick. So here's that GraphQL query. All we want to do this time is really get a couple things. I want to get what path I want to create the page, and I want to get the ID of that page. because we can actually look up all that information about that page later. So I just need to know, how am I going to create pages for the actual URL that I want to access it at, as well as the ID. What it does once that GraphQL query is returned is it's going to essentially loop through all of those results. It's going to look up the path alias, so it's going to try to find that URL that it's supposed to use, and then it's going to actually create the page. All create page is doing here is using that path alias, so it goes to the URL we want, and that way your URL on your Drupal site is going to match up with the URL on your Gatsby site. It's going to pass in the template to use. So if you're familiar with React, React is very component-based, right? Everything's a component in React. This is the same thing. So we're building components for how we want to display our data. So it's going to use this template, and we're going to pass in the Drupal ID. That's how it knows when I get to building that page, how I'm going to look up the information I want to finish building that page. So if I go to this article.js page, I'm importing some things at the top. That's pretty standard. I'm importing a layout, which all the layout is a component that imports a header component, imports a footer component, imports a menu component. So every page looks the same, right? So it gets built. I have a header, I have a footer, I have the little menu. It's pretty simple. And it imports an article component, and that's actually how I display the article. So what it does is it does a little bit of data processing. So this article template, it's just essentially a function that gets called for every page that gets returned from the API. It does a little processing to get the correct video URL, just a quick replace to make sure it gets the right URL for embedding, not for watching. It does some checks just to see if the data is available. There's simpler ways to do that, but it's pretty verbose. It's just checking, is the data available? Okay, set a variable. And then this is where we actually return what we want to display. So you can see it's in a layout component. So this is JSX. Those of you familiar with React, it's going to be self-explanatory. This helmet component is just kind of like metadata. So it's just the title of the page, meta tags if you wanted. So you can kind of ignore that. But we're going to call out to our article component, which actually displays the specific article. So we wrap it into the layout, throw some metadata on it, and then we call our specific article component, which is going to receive, in React terms, these props. So React is all prop-based, right? You pass properties or data down into your components. So we're passing all this information that we need, the tags, the video, the body, whatever series, down into our article component. And our article component is going to look like this. So we have our article component. It receives some props. It's going to display a title and an H2. It's going to display some tags, loop through those tags, display some list items, display all that other information that was on that page. Does that make sense how it's doing that? I mean, some of the code might seem really simple to you or it might be confusing, but you kind of at least understand the process. Does anyone have any questions at this point on what we're doing? Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, maybe not directly related to
Yeah.
this specifically, but and actually, if you could repeat the questions for the
We'll do.
Drupal is not aware of GraphQL at all, right? Drupal is only exposing JSON, and then what's happening in Gatsby is they're hitting whatever endpoints are exposed through this plugin, and it's creating the GraphQL kind of server side and query side all in Gatsby?
Exactly, yes. So if you're familiar with Drupal, there is a Drupal GraphQL module. Think of it as completely different. Does it same process, does the same thing, but they're separate. So that JSON API module exposes all the data. The Gatsby source Drupal plugin goes out and maps the data that's available. So that first build process, it's going out, it's basically traversing the API to build the data structure. So when you pull up that GraphQL editor, it knows what fields are available. So yes, Drupal needs to know nothing about GraphQL. It's completely siloed and separate. GraphQL is, you're accessing it from your Gatsby site to go out and just map that data from the API.
I have another question.
And so the question was, if you does Drupal need to know about GraphQL?
And then I guess the other question I have is this system, it's like pulling in that data and creating kind of static files of that data, or is it continuously referencing what's on Drupal and not actually storing the data in this build process here? Obviously it's not doing it once it's deployed, but like during the build, is it actually pulling that data in and storing it locally, or is it always looking out to Drupal?
So the question is, when you go through this build process, does it pull in the data and store it locally, or is it consistently hitting the API? So when you first run Gatsby develop that command, it's going out, it's pulling in all the data it needs. And if you look inside, it's going to be kind of hard to see here, but there's a public folder, and this is where all your static assets are. So as soon as it compiles, it builds those static assets. So it has that data locally. Now, one of the cool things about Gatsby and the development process, which if you have used other things, developing with Gatsby is it's a fun experience. Like it's very enjoyable. The page automatically refreshes when you make changes. So it feels a lot like a live environment for developing. The only trick though is if you change your GraphQL queries where you need to pull that data in a different way, you have to rerun the command because it has to go out to the API, suck in all the data it needs, and then once it's there, as long as you're not manipulating the data, you can change the layout, the format, whatever, and it'll just live reload inside your development environment. Any other questions before we continue on? We have till what, 7:40, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Making pretty good time then. All right, so the one other thing I'm going to show then is just how we build that kind of that listing page, right? Because all this process did so far, if you follow the code we've done, is it just built the static note, or kind of those article pages. So if I go to an actual page, it built this page, right? This individual page. You can see here's the URL. I could copy that over to the Drupal site and drop it in, and obviously it's going to pull up that same page. So there's the exact same page that I was just on. So it used that path, as I mentioned. It pulled in that same path. It displayed this in the H2 as we saw, displayed that div with the tags, the UL structure, and the video, exactly as we laid it out in that template. Now, just as a quick experience, let's say I wanted to change this to an H1. Probably not going to be fast enough, but if I save that, it should auto reload, and you can see it's a little bit bigger. So it just automatically reloads. You don't have to hit refresh. You don't have to do anything like that. It's just there, which is nice. But now let's look at how we actually build this listing of content on your Gatsby site. So inside your Gatsby folder, you'll have a source folder, and it's just full of JavaScript files. In the index.js, that's kind of your entry point. That's that first page. So Gatsby's going to go in this pages folder and create pages for all of these. So for instance, if I wanted to get to the contact page here, I could just drop in /contact, and there's my contact page. Nothing on it, but you get the idea, right? So if I wanted to create a about me page, I just about-me.js, and I drop my code in that page. When you run the build process, Gatsby will build a page at that URL. So if we look at that contact page, there's nothing there, but this is really kind of the minimum you need, right? So essentially I'm pulling in my layout, which is the header and footer, and I'm dropping in some content there, and that's it. So if we go back to this main index page, or this listing page, let's look at that. So this one's a little bit more complex, but it kind of breaks down the same way. So you're exporting a query, and this query is going to run when that page is created. So this is just another GraphQL query with very similar to that last one we ran. The only difference is I'm only pulling in 25 articles. Eventually I'll put in a pager or whatever, but I'm just pulling in 25 articles, pulling in these fields, the body, the path, the created date in this specific format, the video field. So it's going to run that as soon as it's trying to build this index page. And then it's going to pass that data in through props to this actual component here. And then from there, you can do the same thing we did on the other, kind of when we were building that individual article page. Do some processing, normalize our data however we want, and then I'm going to return another component. This one's just an article teaser. I'm passing in my props, my title, my created, date, my video, my body, my path. If we follow that trail down, so I go to my article teaser, you can see that just returns a link with a title. So that's when I click on the title, it brings me to the actual article page. It checks here if props.video, if there's a video, I'm going to use a YouTube component, and I'll show you what that is, but that's just another React component. So when you're thinking about, and if you're familiar with React, the goal is to make everything as much as possible components, right? You want to build small, minuscule components that essentially manage their own state, right? They have their own, they receive props, they display data. You kind of want to simplify it down to that level. So of course, we could have done this all on that index page. We did not have to add in separate components, but by breaking it up, you are making it a lot easier on yourself. If there's something wrong with the YouTube video, for instance, I just go to the YouTube component, and then it'll be fixed in all the YouTube videos that are used, right? So it's a little easier to think about it, and especially if you're coming from the React world, you already know. Breaking things down into smaller pieces, smaller components is just a better design pattern. Then we have a link, and down here, some of you probably know what prop types are, but I'm basically saying that I want this to be, the title's going to be a string, the body's going to be a string, and it's required, so it has to be passed in. So it's more or less just telling your component what type of data it can expect to receive. So just to take a look at that YouTube component as well, it's a pretty simple one. Some inline styles here, just some basic, make it a little bit more responsive, but essentially it's just an iframe that drops in this props.video, and that's really it. I mean, it's just essentially if you grabbed YouTube and YouTube's embed code and then a little bit of styling on top of it, but that's really all it is. So there's not much to it, but that way you're breaking things down into components. So that kind of tells you how you get from data from your Drupal site pulled in through GraphQL into your Gatsby site, right? Any other questions before we kind of move on and review? Yes?
Okay, so how is it mapping the URLs at that point? Or is, I guess, contact is a special case?
So
how does it know that? Yeah,
all right, great question. So anything that is in pages here will get built as its own page, basically minus the .js on the end, minus the extension. So pages are kind of a special case, right? If you want to create a page, and I'm pretty sure, I haven't actually tested this, but I think you can do folder structures there too, right? If you had a folder, you had a JS inside that folder, it'll map that URL just like it's doing with the folder structure. Now, when it goes through the initial build process, it creates the path during that create pages section of code. So when we look at Gatsby node here, during this part, it's creating all those internal pages dynamically, right? So we have kind of the static JS for building that static contact page, but we also have a process for building all those other internal pages based on the data that we pulled in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it ends up being a hybrid.
Yeah,
some of it's from Gatsby, most of it's from Drupal.
Exactly, yeah. So if you had more of your static pages that weren't going to change, you could do, you could put them directly in Gatsby, or you could pull those directly from Drupal too if you wanted to allow a content editor to be able to edit the contact page. I probably wouldn't put it in here. I would probably pull that specific piece of content out of Drupal, so a content editor on your site could change the contact page.
Or even like curating someone else's data, in which case you want to receive the contact info.
Yeah, exactly. So it really,
flexibility.
Yeah, it's flexible. So, and as I mentioned before, if you're building a simple Gatsby site, you might not use Drupal. You might just use Markdown files, because you could actually do this. You can pull in Markdown files. You can pull in other things, or you could put it right in the JS if you wanted as well. All right, so let's close this down quickly. Spin up the presentation again. And again, as I mentioned before, this presentation is just a Gatsby site built very, very similarly. Just has a few transitions built in to make it a little bit more flexible, but you're essentially just flipping through markdown pages. All right. So we're going to do a quick recap. And it might sound like a broken record, but I'm just trying to get the whole process down, and we'll look at a little bit more code again just because we can kind of go through it. But we'll do it pretty quickly. So on the Drupal side, it's all about content types, how you want to model your data. If you're using WordPress or you're using Contentful or Netlify CMS, whatever it is, you're going to model your data in whatever's natural to that environment. You're going to model it, put fields on it. And those fields could be anything. Could be media, could be text, could be taxonomy terms, numbers, whatever. And the Drupal side, we turn on the JSON API module. That's it. That's all we got to do. So if you already have a Drupal site, you literally just turn on the JSON API module, and you can start interacting with it while you're building, or with Gatsby. On the Gatsby side, so all you really need to do to get started, the very bare minimum, is Gatsby new, whatever your project name is, assuming you have it downloaded, installed. And it uses Node, so npm install the Drupal source plugin. That's what knows how to go out using the JSON API and pull in the data. Can't really see this, but that's just those 4 or so lines of config that we need to tell it. This important part is right here, just the URL. Actually, you could even take this line, this API base, because that's the default. But using JSON API, one of those extra modules that you don't need to turn on necessarily, I think it's the JSON API is extra. You can set your endpoint, so maybe you don't want it to be /JSON API. You want it to be /API or whatever it is. So you could change that endpoint, and then you would just map that with your API base, whatever you want that endpoint to be. And then GraphQL is the connector between the two. So it allows you to pull in data. I did not plan for mobile first, or maybe if this was mobile it'd be better actually. But this is the important part, the page query here, and just gets all node articles, pulls in the title, the created date, the body. It uses the special relationships to get any kind of entity reference field in the Drupal world, which would be videos, images, and anything that's connected, taxonomy terms as well, if you're familiar with Drupal. And then Gatsby goes through this process. It pulls in just the Drupal ID and the path, and it creates these pages in that gatsby-node.js file. So again, you don't need to worry about this part up there. That's just doing some basic logic. But it runs this create page, pulls in the path, passes it the template I want to use, passes it the Drupal ID. That's really it. So if I wanted to use this with any other content type, I basically create a template, tweak the content type and fields on that GraphQL query, and as soon as you run that Gatsby develop command, it's going to fire up and it's going to build all those pages. So this all maps to the template, and then if you follow the component structure down, you're just building out React components at that point, right? So you can map that however you want. So we kind of already did that. So yeah, at the end, it's all just React components once you get the data in. And Gatsby does have things built in. Yeah, I thought it'd be even funnier just not having an image, because I ran out of time, to be honest. But Gatsby has other plugins built in. So, and the whole goal is to make it fast, right? That's the kind of the preface of Gatsby. So it's very simple to add like image blur effects. So when you go to a page, it's expensive to load in a high quality image, right? So what Gatsby can do with just a few lines of configuration, it'll create a blurred version of that image, and then once all the page renders, it'll go out and it'll pull in the actual full resolution of that image. So that way, your time to first paint, if you ever do any kind of performance analysis on your site, the time to first paint or the time to first that the user basically thinks that the site's loaded or can see something on the site is much faster, because you don't need to load those big assets. The content's stored, the image is in place, everything looks like it's in the right spot, and then once it gets to it, it can load that image. The other thing that Gatsby does that's really cool is, let's say you have a long page. So I have that page with 25 articles. What Gatsby will do, and I think you can actually see it, I haven't actually tested this recently, but you can see it on the network tab. It'll start loading links down further in the page. So it will preload that content. So if I would scroll down after it sits there for a little bit and I click, that page is already loaded, ready to go. So it essentially doesn't even seem like there's a load time. It's almost instantaneous because the page is already there. You just didn't even know it. And so with that and with the image kind of blur up effect, it can really seem like you have a very responsive website in the fact that you click a button and it's immediate. But there are some gotchas when you're working with Drupal. Images and videos using Drupal Media, you have to use this weird relationships field. It's kind of hard to find the data. It took me a while to really dig through the GraphQL Explorer to find it. And so if you're using other content sources, even though GraphQL makes it a good experience to search what's available, there's a lot of just guessing, checking. You got to guess and check and see what's available, and so it can take some time to really figure out where all the data lies. Inline images, so in Drupal or in a lot of CMS systems, content editors want to be able to use either WYSIWYGs or CK editor type experience and drop in an image. Those are a little trickier too, because you basically have to parse the body field that's coming back. There are plugins with either Remark or Markdown that can suck in those images and pull them locally. It's just an extra step. There's some extra thought you have to put into getting that to work. But it does work, you just have to go through that process. And embedded videos are a little tricky, just because you got to figure out, especially with Drupal, if you use Drupal's core media and you embed videos, you got to make sure you're getting the right embed code. And I haven't worked with local videos, but I know Gatsby does have a plugin for it, so I'm assuming that would work a little bit easier maybe, but I'm not sure. And if you're familiar with Drupal, Drupal has something called paragraphs or entity reference fields where you can build complex data structures. And because they're so complex, it's very difficult to work with kind of on the Gatsby front. So at Third and Grove, we allow our clients to build very complex landing pages, right? Maybe it's a hero component on top with an image slider, and however you might format a page, we can break it down into components and allow the client to build out that very complex page. Mapping that to something that you could build in Gatsby though, because you're giving them the flexibility to reorganize components on the page, it's difficult to do. So it's not something that you can easily kind of pull over from if you're building those types of sites with Drupal. And hosting is different. If you're familiar with CMS type hosting, right? Whether it's PHP or another one of those more dynamic sites, you typically have a database, you have something that processes a request, pulls data from the database. Hosting's different. All you got to do to get your site ready to host is Gatsby build and then upload the static files. So hosting in a lot of ways is actually a lot easier because it's just static content. It's HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You drop in that public folder, everything gets built. You just drop it, whether it's FTP or a build tool on your command line, you can just drop it on a host and it's good to go. So it's cheaper, it's more secure because there's nothing to log, you don't have the logins, you don't have a lot of that dynamic things. So there's less entry points for some person to potentially compromise your site. But it's also more complicated in some ways too, especially if you have some kind of build process where you're using another storage system like Drupal or WordPress or one of these other systems, because you have now two things you're managing, right? So and this is especially true if I just wanted to use Drupal as my local site, right, and I just wanted to build locally, that's easy. But as soon as I want other people to be able to manage the content or edit that content and then build into Gatsby, because there's that build process, it gets a little bit more complicated. So for hosting, This one I'm using Pantheon. That's a good Drupal hosting company. Acquia is another great Drupal hosting company. So there's ways to host the Drupal backend, but now you're hosting 2 websites, right? You have Drupal site, you have Gatsby site. So even though Gatsby hosting's cheap, you'll also be hosting this site that might be used primarily just for content editors to edit. Now, we'll talk about making it more dynamic, but at that level, it's just a little bit more complicated. For static hosting, you can use really any host, but Netlify is a really popular one right now that a lot of you probably heard of. You can even use GitHub Pages, CloudFront. Anything that can host static HTML would work on the Gatsby side. So the big question is, though, if I was going to build this for a client, how do I get that build process to work, right? If I create this new post, a client can't go in to the command line and run a process and then export their site. So Drupal has a module called build hooks. There's a couple other options, one called webhooks. They do the same thing, but essentially when you update content, it'll trigger basically an endpoint on a service like Netlify, I believe is a good one. There's a couple others that allow it, that'll trigger the build process for you. So if I were to create the new page, it would go out there and it could be set up to automatically ping and it would automatically build the site, and then my site would be updated automatically. So I wouldn't even know that there's this build process happening. I would just know that it maybe takes a few minutes and then it'll be ready. But it's not always a good thing. You got to be careful with that too, because on very large scale sites, you don't want any edit on your site to trigger this build process. So if you think you had 10 editors on your site and they're all working on the site during the day, you're going to be spinning up builds left and right, and essentially you're invalidating all the CDN or any kind of caching mechanisms you are putting in place. So, and if you do have posts that have to go live at specific times, that's also a little bit tricky. You can't just do that. So ultimately you need to find a process that works for you, but it's pretty flexible, so you can make it work. You just got to know those considerations. So you might be thinking, and I know I'm kind of running short on time, but it's so static. Like, this is just a static site. What can you do with a static website? But it's built on top of React. So it can be much more dynamic than that. So you can do user authentication. As soon as your Gatsby site loads, it refreshes, I don't know the exact term, basically it refreshes with React, the component state with React. And so you can use React just like you normally would. So if you want to have your site be 70% static with Gatsby and 30% React components that are live, that are hitting that Drupal API, or if you're using another service, you can do that too. It's not just for static websites. So when you think Gatsby, don't just think static. Think it starts static, but then it's just React. So anything you can do in React, you can do in Gatsby. So you could display dynamic content for users. You could have a login system. You could have authentication. You can make the API requests that you normally would make to display users' orders. You have a shopping cart, anything like that you could do. It would just be making API calls. If you're familiar with React, you probably have plugins you use. Maybe it's Axios or whatever it is, or whatever you want for to basically connect to the API. You can do things like maybe hit a Solr search server. If you have a lot of data, you might have a separate search server as well, and you want to ping that search server. You can display those results. So you could have something where you have Solr up here, and what Gatsby site actually pings the search server. So that's really all there is. I'll ask for some if you have questions, but the Gatsby website's a great resource. They have really good getting started. GatsbyGuides.com is a good way if you want to get started. It specifically uses Drupal, so there's a good Drupal base. You can build a Drupal website, you can build your Gatsby site, it'll ingest the data, it walks you through step by step. And Benji Fisher has this repo that he just posted. I didn't use it for this, but it's a good starting point. If you've ever used Lando, which is just a development environment, you essentially pull it down, you run one command, it'll spin up a Gatsby site and a Drupal site for you, and that's it. So git clone, Lando start, you got a Gatsby site running. And Lando is just built on Docker and Docker Compose, so if you're familiar with those technologies. So in conclusion, it's Gatsby and Drupal sitting in tree. You can contact me, email, Twitter. Third and Grove's hiring, so if you're interested, let us know. And I didn't build this Gatsby site completely by scratch. I used a starter deck, so I just left it here as, if you want to build your own poorly designed animation with Gatsby or slideshow, you can do so. Any questions? Yes.
So if you're hosting like a client project with headless Drupal, what would you like? Could you disable the front end of your regular Drupal site, or what would you do with that?
So you'd probably put it at a URL that only you would access, and you would make it. So you would want to make it, because technically, as soon as you have the API, right, you'd want to make it public. But one thing I didn't show in that config is you can add authentication to that. So you could have a user account that could access that API data that's not public. You put it in the Gatsby config, and so you could have a Drupal site maybe at a different URL. None of the content's public, but the people that are administrators could log in, build the content, and then the Gatsby site would have authentication to that site to pull in the data. So it wouldn't necessarily be a public-facing site. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to build one Drupal site and sort of put it at a proxy URL somewhere like you're talking about, could you build sort of like multiple landing pages at different URLs that you're building to from there? So could you build to site1.com, site2.com with the second page and so forth? Like, could you use it as a base for building out to a bunch of URLs?
So you're
But
saying
in Drupal, you're not generally doing that, right? Like, it's one URL you build on.
typically with Drupal it is, yeah. That doesn't have to be, but typically it could be. I mean, there are other, either multi-site or domain access. There's modules that make you or allow you to be able to do that. But so let me just see if I can clarify the question. So you're asking if you could have multiple sites and Drupal is kind of a centralized hub.
Yeah, is it a good way to build a bunch of landing pages and mini sites that way? Like, is it good? Because if it's fast and easy to deploy in different places, and you're building static stuff based on, dynamic anyway, but not like dynamic in a shopping cart sense, then, can you basically use it as sort of like a simple deployment mechanism? Like
You could. There'd be some things. There's some questions I would have as how you would do it logistically between. Because you still have to spin up, if you're using Gatsby, a Gatsby instance to pull in the specific pages you build on Drupal and deploy it. So there'd still be this kind of manual step. And depending if it's just a landing page, it might be easier just to build it just in Gatsby and leave Drupal completely out of it, depending on what it is. So I know that the Gatsby team's working with not just Drupal, but other providers to be able to do more dynamic stuff like that. But I don't know if that's in the roadmap or anything that we'd see where you could do it more dynamically to deploy different sites. I'm not sure on that. Yeah.
If with GraphQL, you can go to an endpoint and kind of query for whatever you want, how does that work with Drupal if it's using like a RESTful convention?
So how does the mechanism work between how GraphQL pulls the data from Drupal? Is that the question?
Yeah, so I guess like if you go to an endpoint on any RESTful like thing and it's like a user's endpoint or something, like you get your request for users, but would you still have to just use GraphQL to like kind of hit all those different endpoints?
Yes, so you're saying, so for instance, in this Drupal site, there's all these different endpoints. If I wanted to get all of the node pages, I think I could just go to this endpoint here and it would give me the node pages. So you're saying how does GraphQL know that I might want something from this resource, something from another resource? So I don't know I don't know that I can fully answer that question because I don't know the internals of how it works, but I know from what I've read that GraphQL basically, it understands all these endpoints and it composes the most efficient queries it can, so it hits the API as little as possible. But it might have to make multiple requests to get all the different data. But the good thing about that is you don't have to make multiple API requests. GraphQL handles that for you. So if I had data from the page and I also had data that was potentially media up here, right? This media image or media file or media video, it'll run both of those queries to pull back that information. So I don't know the internals of how it works, but I know it's supposed to be relatively efficient in how it constructs those API calls.
Yeah, I would assume that the Drupal Gatsby plugin is creating the GraphQL server, right? Like, Because you
Yeah.
have to do the GraphQL client queries. I would imagine that that's creating the server. Because you can do a GraphQL query against just a JSON API as far as I know. Something's creating that GraphQL server. And I think it's the plugin, right?
So GraphQL is built into Gatsby, but the plugin, from my understanding, will essentially traverse this API and build those relationships so it knows those relationships exist, and then it knows how to hit all the endpoints that are there when you're constructing that query. Yes.
If you were building this for a client, would you have to choose? It seems like you would be templating in 2 different environments. If they're entering data into
Yes.
Drupal,
That-
then they would end up seeing it somewhere else. Would you choose to just have them enter into unstyled kind of boxes?
Yeah. So the question was, and this is a great question because it was my first question when I was kind of thinking about this too, is if you had a client, they'd have to enter data, and it would not maybe look the same as what it's going to look like on the Gatsby side when it pulls in. So that's a great question. And so again, it's one of those things. I know that the Gatsby team has plans to work on more of like a live reload type experience where you could see it more efficiently rather than having to go through this build process. I think it's just in the works. I have no idea on any kind of timeline or what it would even look like. So yeah, there is that thing of if you had to style a page, you'd essentially be doing it twice anyways, and it might not be worth that kind of headache, because as a content editor, you'd either have to visualize that you know what it's going to look like, or you'd have to have someone have built that template so you can see that it's going to look, pretty much the same. So I mean, I know one of the things, I have some ideas on how you could maybe do that, where essentially my thought process is you would want Gatsby to essentially take over your Drupal theme, but it'd have to be able to build that specific page immediately, and that's not built into Gatsby right now. It has to go through this entire compile process, where if I could tell Gatsby, just build this page when I save this page and display it here, then maybe you could at some point use Gatsby as a front end for Drupal. But again, that could be maybe never happen or a long ways off. So yeah.
Yeah, that gave me a bit of a headache. So to build on that, so your CSS is primarily going to be in the Gatsby realm, right?
Yes.
And then I imagine from what I recall last time I looked at Drupal, it has some kind of gnarly HTML that comes out, but then you're also wrapping that in React, so it seems like pretty
So
a little unpredictable. What the final HTML is.
So the one thing is, when you get to control the markup that goes into Gatsby, so you're only pulling the data points. So the only way you would be getting gnarly HTML from Drupal is if you're pulling in like that body field, right, where a client could enter in their own markup. Otherwise, you control the exact data. So on the Gatsby side, you would know exactly what you're getting, besides maybe that one component if you let them do that. But on the Drupal side, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of different templates. It uses a Twig templating engine, at least in Drupal 8. So it can there can be a lot of markup. But yes, your CSS is typically on the Gatsby side, but if you want to see it on the Drupal side, as you saw, it doesn't look the same on the Drupal side, right? It's just this list. If you gave this to a client and said, here you go, that's probably not going to work. So there's still work to be done here on how to make this work, especially for, right now it's really built for either a development team that's managing a site, because it's not a big deal to get into the code and change things if needed, but I think the goal is to get it to be a little bit more mainstream, where an agency could maybe use it with clients. It's just maybe not quite there yet, but it's getting there.
Yeah, I can see cases where they want to, in their little WYSIWYG docs, make this bold, make this, throw in you mentioned the inline images and the difficulties with that stuff, and there seems to be a bit of a tension between you want to allow the editors to add some basically markup, but then you don't want them to make their own styles. So,
yeah, well, the good thing with Drupal is you can control what every tag and that you allow. so you can control what tags they can hit. Yeah, so you can say, I only want you to be able to do, bold. I have, maybe 3 classes. You can have like a styled class drop down. You can use these 3 classes. You can't use, divs or JavaScript or anything like that. It's just, you got paragraph tags, list items, bold, italicized, and then maybe links, and you can style them as buttons with this drop down or something like that. You can control that experience with Drupal. There you can create multiple editors for each WYSIWYG field, so it's not you don't have to. It's not the Wild West necessarily, but again, you have to decide how much flexibility you want to give your client, and then if you give them too much, you have to deal with that flexibility. Then if you did ingest it in the Gatsby side.
Sounds good.
Any other questions? I know we went a little bit long, but
I have a question, and just a point on that as well. So you don't have to do style all through WYSIWYG. You could do like structured style, right? For instance, you could have a text field, and then you could have a select list that says H1, H2, H3, and then the JSON would produce 2 field outputs. It'd be like, here's the data was put in a select list, and then they chose H2, and you could consume that data, and then you could style it, your own way. And that's like a silly example, but you could do a lot of structured kind of stuff, and then you don't have to rely on a WYSIWYG at all, right? You can just like structure it.
right, yeah. So if you had a very defined template, this is exactly what an article is, or this is exactly what, and that's really what, when I mentioned kind of paragraphs and entity reference fields in Drupal, that's what that does, is it kind of defines it, makes it a little bit more flexible than being a strict structured template, but that's really the point, is you could structure it into fields to give your client less flexibility, but still make them feel like they have full control over what they're building.
I actually have one last question.
Yes.
So in this case, we're taking like a data source from Drupal and we're pulling it in exactly and displaying it in our own way. If we wanted to pre-process some of the data somehow, say for instance, we're pulling data in from a blog that uses a lot of curse words and we don't want to display that on our end. We want to find swears and we want to take them out. Or we're working with a blog that has frequent spelling errors and we want to correct those. Is there any way we can process the data before we get to the display?
So I haven't done it, but it gets pulled in, and I did some basic, it's JavaScript, right? So you can pull in React plugins, there's Gatsby plugins that process Markdown, so there is that process step. So any data that comes in could be processed. You could, even on the simplest, the simplest term, you could just pass it to a JavaScript function, right? So whatever you want to do in that JavaScript function, search for this word that you want to remove, and that's what I did with YouTube embed URLs. So at a simple level, is the YouTube embed URL I paste in was !watch equals whatever the ID is. But if you want to embed that, YouTube requires you to change that to /embed/ whatever the ID is. So I just did a simple string replace, and that worked. So yes, you could do, I'm assuming, infinitely complex stuff there if you wanted. You just have to obviously write the code to do it. All right. Anything else? Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.